Hello everyone, it's Nis. I figured I'd make an off-the-cuff thing while I've been hard at work with a few projects taking longer than I expected, and recent events bring up a topic that warrants discussion that I do take interest in. Might even be worth a long-form, better researched video at some point. Cards on the table. I never really cared about the Game Awards, even for indie categories. I've always seen these award shows as a glorified popularity contest at the best of times. I don't have much interest in getting further affirmation on things that I know are good and or popular enough to hit the mainstream. Whatever is being talked about on social media beforehand, I just assume is going to get nominated. Expedition 33 has been hitting a lot of circles of discussion, not only because it had received 9 awards and 13 nominations during the Game Awards event, breaking records, but it's also gotten a lot higher from these results, and the part I'm primarily focused on is the argument of it not being an indie game. There's a lot of arguments for this. An indie game has no place for the use of generative AI. An indie game shouldn't have millions in its budget. An indie game shouldn't have a team of around 50 people. An indie game shouldn't have a publisher, and if that's too untenable, they at least shouldn't have one with a shareholder such as NetEase. It's not a very clearly defined thing, the qualifiers for it being vague by design, and people draw lines at different points, which for the most part is not an issue, but this discourse goes to show exactly how it can end up being like untangling Christmas lights. But maybe we can get a couple bulbs loose. Starting with the topic of AI, already walking on eggshells it seems, but I'm the one who picked the topic first. The argument is, can games have generative AI, specifically generative, and still be an indie game? I think it's certainly possible, but not in the way it's currently used. Like, if you're using generative AI to make amalgams with prompts only using art of your own, or people on your team who knew and were on board with it, that's undoubtedly a creative way to get inspiration. But we all know why it's used under basically every circumstance. A shortcut. A shortcut's not necessarily bad, filling in any busy work that needs to be done but doesn't actually require any creative input on the creator's behalf. I'm all for that. But if you're getting your ideas or filling in blanks with generative AI, then I would argue those ideas weren't your own, therefore not independent. It's not the same as using an IP or a multitude of them to form inspiration, which basically everything and everyone does to some degree, but these ideas were rooted in the creator's mind as something that they can expand upon or reinterpret. It requires some beforehand interest and even potential in understanding what makes it special. While something AI generated is derived off of the existence of content elsewhere, you won't have the knowledge of what is being expressed. It is inspiration without the roots. And I think most can agree that not understanding what something is and why something is worth taking notes or making homage to results in failing to capture the very essence of the media. But we're not here for lectures on AI and discussing when it stops being a tool. Looking at our example, how did E33 incorporate it? From what I've gathered, the generative AI was used for early on placeholders and a few had slipped through the cracks during development. This includes textures such as a set of newspapers. As you might know, Gen AI is really bad at mimicking text in an image, let alone making coherent sentences. So it is easy to miss, but becomes blatant if you look at it with any sense of scrutiny. We could never know for sure if they intended to get away with that, but with how they immediately owned up to it and how relatively easy it would have been to just make a filler newspaper texture, I think it was an honest mistake, and at this point during development, this would have been around when Gen AI was still being seen by many as a novelty. These newspaper textures are very early in the game, so were likely part of the development infancy. Others may be skeptical, as textures would be the type of thing you'd want to AI generate to cut out busy work, but to be frank, I don't really care. So long as it's being used on an already established art style by the team, I think using it for simple environmental textures once again makes it a tool. My issue here lies in the fact that it was newspapers, which means a lot of world building and foreshadowing is being missed out on, as well as creative expression of the setting and how they write and format said newspapers. This is why I mean why I say it can get complicated. Either way, this resulted in their disqualification in the Indie Game Awards 2025. A shame, since all that was stated seems to indicate that they were the ones who were going to win. This course of events had also led to the IGA making a post in their FAQ of eligibility that makes utilizing generative AI not eligible for nomination. It's honestly the only clear-cut part of the qualifiers, so we can safely assume that applies to placeholders, storyboards, and concept art. That seems pretty damning, but I feel the need to point out that even the IGA admit that they're not the deciding party of what makes a game indie, and don't utilize any official definition. I find the qualifiers are understandable, but some would be arbitrary in a vacuum. I think the subject of Gen AI use is a case-by-case thing because of stuff like this. That newspaper texture definitely didn't influence the artistic nature or expression of the game, though the game did suffer in a way from having it rather than the actual articles that could have been Easter eggs. Using Gen AI doesn't necessarily make your product not indie, but it does take soul from it. How much, again, is case by case. Despite the previous subject being on how soulless it can make a product, the budget, ironically, is far more material and easy to cover. An indie game having millions in its pocket does feel intuitively wrong for classification, and that's for an ongoing theme for this video, and one I'm sure that'll roll some eyes. That indie gaming has a certain vibe and aesthetic to it that a lot of indie stuff has. To be low budget, to be less accessible, to be less visible on shelves, to care less about what your potential customers think, and to make your work unbound by those expectations, even if those decisions might be a mistake. And there's something appealing about that. That's why a lot of people in these spaces will scoff at E33 being praised for being so high quality with a low budget of $10 million. Though I will say in the grand scheme of things that having a few million in your total budget is actually not that impressive for a company, especially in the gaming industry, which boy oh boy I hope has a collapse soon because AAA needs a humbling more than ever. But to put simply, costs can rack up depending on living fees, potential office space, and even marketing. The tools to make indies usually don't cost that much. It's more the time and training, so that's at least not an issue. This sounds very corporate for the indie space. When I say indie, you might be thinking about the crack addict in the dark, dingy bedroom testing the absolute limits of Game Maker Studio, where the disposable income from their 9 to 5 is their budget, and I love them for it. But I would still argue both are indie. The vision hasn't actually been compromised for either, just what they can realistically put into it. A lot of high budget things aren't indie, but it's not the money that takes it out of them, rather how they use it and where it comes from. This is why publishers, shareholders, and parent companies are a huge factor to this element, and why when Ubisoft tried to claim the Rogue Prince of Persia was at indie scale, primarily for using Dead Cells as a mold, they were laughed out of the room, rightfully so. But by the logic that the cutoff point is in the millions, rather than the things that come with having a budget of millions, Yacht Club, Supergiant Games, Team Cherry, Toby Fox and Timmy Chang, and Daniel Mullins can no longer make indies. So although it can be the root of it, I don't like the implication that it's like someone sold out because they're no longer underground. That through success alone can a developer end up stop being indie. That they can no longer drop a weird itch.io game out of the blue. Because let's not forget, Supergiant aren't just the Hades guys, despite what a lot of people might think. They've been very successful contenders in the indie gaming market for over a decade. What would likely be considered their worst game is amazing, with a unique setting, gameplay, voice acting, lovable cast, and a cult following who probably resent the very idea I implied fault to it. They've had success for several years to build up reputation and money, to the point where they got to make a temporary Epic Games exclusive deal with Hades for yet more money. We forgave Supergiant. Doesn't mean I think you should forget, though. This is why I think later arguments that would include or imply how the money is obtained and used is more compelling. Honestly, I think this is a bigger factor than the actual budget. The more people you involve in your work, by the nature of it, the less of your own unfiltered vision of said work will be inside depending on the amount of people and their involvement. Even if you give them exact direction and they follow it precisely without questioning, small deviations will occur. This does not mean the product will suffer from it. Sometimes the contrary. They may add perspective that improve your vision or discourage you from ideas that are irrelevant or fly off the handle from the original intent. So although they'll dilute the original vision, more people can also be helpful for refining and improving upon it. That being said, the closer you get to the triple digits in your staff of people directly involved in the game, the more ridiculous it looks to call it independent. Now, there's no official cap on how many people an indie team can have, but I start raising an eyebrow after the first couple dozen. I'd probably still be more lenient towards a team of 30 than a team of 4, but one was a contract worker they brought on. Well, onto E33 as a relevant example. Sandfall's staff consists of around 50 people. 30 were part of the core team for that game. Not really an issue for me. Supergiant have around that many in form of staff, and I think most people would still be willing to call them an indie studio, a very successful and well-respected one at that. To reference the gap here, people still argued whether Larian Studios was a AA or AAA company by the release of Baldur's Gate 3, which launched them into the mainstream, and their staffing was over 500 people. So although there's not an exact line, I'm pretty comfortable with the intuition here until they come into question through something empiric like an award ceremony, such as the example here. Alright, on to publishers, which this one gets really confusing, to the point where it's definitely further bleeding over to the indie game as a vibe and an aesthetic mindset that can sometimes be arbitrary but does have its uses as unofficial intuition. Some purists will state that any game that has a developer is no longer indie, full stop. It may be small, it may even be solo developed, low budget, an underdog, but it is still dependent on something else by design. Although I don't agree with this stance, I don't find it ridiculous either. It's a hard line to draw, and in discussions with definitions like these, that's basically what you're looking for. The thing is, nobody would describe indie that way in normal conversation, and it would basically lock away the definition for incredibly specific cases that are either too small for the stakes to matter, or already so big and successful that they don't need a publisher, leaving exclusively crowdfunded projects in the middle. Unless of course you're also counting being dependent on the crowd as not being indie. But then, are you dependent on your employer when you're a self-funded game? I mean, I don't know where the line would be drawn there. Point is, there's a lot more than that we would traditionally call an indie game. But the specific publisher is very wishy-washy in this regard. I've heard some of the objections being that NetEase is a major funder of Kepler Studios pretty early in the company's lifespan, and became a minor shareholder. For those not in the know, NetEase is a Chinese company with its fingers in a few pies in the gaming industry. It's seen by many as being akin to Tencent, and as the developer and publisher of Marvel Rivals, which it is also an open secret that they have censorship related to that of China, meaning you can't bring up controversial events in China or mentioning Winnie the Pooh. I'm getting off track. My point is that yes, by this logic, they could constrain the artistic expression of a game in the name of some form of censorship for the country, even if nothing was even insinuated. That being said, I don't think that this has happened in any development of E33, and I'm not sure if we got any cases to actually prove that. And until proven otherwise, I don't think NetEase has had any direct influence on the game's development. Some might call this a cop-out, but I will remind you that NetEase has stocks in Devolver and tinyBuild, which are huge publishers for the indie gaming industry, and that we'd have to take their titles out of the definition by this logic. If you're willing to bite the bullet on that, by all means, but I'm not. I would need more evidence of publisher interference than them being a big company, or that the developer is using a publisher or large company's intellectual property to make a game. That's basically advertisement with the developer being freelance, like the aforementioned Prince of Persia, but also Bubsy 4D, and the Spike and Unique 40k games. This is why I consider Guns, Gore, and Cannoli to be indie games, but not Shooters, Blood, and Teeth, despite them being made by the same teams. Alright, listen. I never said I'd have a clear definition by the end of this ride, but I'd kick myself if I didn't at least try. So for the fun of it, I'm gonna set what my qualifiers would be if I ran an Indie Games Award ceremony. To be eligible for the hypothetical NIS Indie Game Awards, the game must be made by roughly between 1 to 50 people. More is negotiable, but the hard cap is 100. The game cannot be made to market an intellectual property that otherwise would not be considered indie. Parodies and other content not licensed by the owner of the IP do not fall under this, and the game cannot use generative AI in the final product. This shouldn't be so limiting that blacklists ex-AAA devs, technically ban using the Magic Wand tool, and hopefully prevent sock puppet development teams from overshadowing other installments. But you listening to this have probably already considered a few loopholes for such rules. Part of it is because of how simplistic and loose the qualifiers are. This would be in the context of these rules in its first establishment and would evolve over the years as the awards went on. But the other reason is the very subject itself. Indie is a very slippery qualifier. We're so used to using it as a vibe in a lot of cases, but many things it's applied to are technically not indie because it's become so much larger as a medium, more accessible, but also more marketable, which is great but also has its downsides. There's a reason there's so much malice and vitriol behind the phrase, "I hope the thing you love becomes Netflix popular." For what it's worth, it's not like we need these definitions to be concrete. They just have to be agreed upon in debates and discussions on what qualifies an indie game, which I mean, that's between the parties discussing it, not us. But lastly, in competitions around them, like, say, an award ceremony, which that one, I think, doesn't have an excuse for not having a definition, even if it's not officially agreed upon. For the rest of us who don't need to be quantitative of the whole thing, I think it's perfectly fine to call something that's janky, low budget, and artsy an indie game. It's useful for intuiting what you can expect, even in cases where it's technically incorrect. Because even if the line was drawn strictly, indie games still have a wide array of environments of not only genre, team size, but sense of professionalism. For every cozy pseudo-simulator game, you're gonna have an insane mess slapdash together on a game-making engine, or one pretending to be slapdash together on a game-making engine, and I'd have it no other way. So, with all of that out of the way, I hope you all enjoyed the last video of mine for the year, and with all this talk on popular titles, I thought it'd be fun to recommend an array of games that I enjoyed playing or like the look of that released in 2025, as well as a listing of games that I'm looking forward to that might release in 2026. You never know with devs without a deadline and a polishing obsession. Anyways, I hope you all have a good day and be safe.